used to think that the silence up here is something the tower grew on purpose, like the pale lichen that creeps across the northern masonry when the autumn rain sets in. But if you look back through the very first records, the ones written on unrefined sheepskin before the kingdom even established the standard paper mills, you realize the quiet was always here. The stone walls were just built around it to keep the mountain wind from blowing it away. The background music drifting through the floorboards tonight has this beautifully static, looping quality, doesn't it? It feels like the slow, heavy pendulum of a clock that hasn't been oiled since the last coronation, holding on to those deep, resonant chords until they turn completely soft in the corners of the rafters. I've been spending the evening translating the Journal of Eldon. He was the very first observer appointed to the spire, living here nearly 100 winters before Orestes ever untied the leather cords of the Grand Ledger. In Eldon's time, the telescope didn't have the grand brass tracking gears or the green volcanic glass lenses. The main viewing window was just an open, unglazed stone archway, completely exposed to the elements, where he would sit with a heavy iron cross staff resting on his shoulder to measure the distance between the primary houses. He wrote his entries using chunks of raw, charred willow twigs instead of ink. When you run your finger over the old parchment, the carbon still comes off on your skin, leaving a dull gray smudge that smells faintly of ancient hearth fire and cold hearthstones. Eldon's notes don't talk about the high-altitude skiffs or the political boundaries of the lower valleys, because back then, the valleys were completely dark. There were no trading posts at the base of the mountain, no lantern-lit highways, and no salt wagons crossing the flats. There was only the forest, a vast unbroken sea of black pine that stretched all the way to the western horizon, looking completely solid under the light of the moon. He writes extensively about the month of the silver moths. It happened during his third summer on the peak. He woke up around midnight to find the open stone archway completely blocked by a thick, shimmering curtain of pale wings. Millions of them had flown up from the deep valley woods, drawn by the single tallow candle he kept burning on his desk. They didn't fly into the flame to burn themselves, though. Eldon noted that they had just settled along the iron framework of his instruments, laying over the metal until the cross staff looked like it was made of soft, white velvet. When the wind blew through the archway, the moths would collectively flutter their wings to stay attached, creating this low, rhythmic humming sound that filled the entire attic. A sound he described as identical to the breathing of a giant, sleeping child. He spent 3 whole days sitting on his wooden stool, completely unable to take his measurements because the sky was entirely obscured by the living frost of their bodies. Instead of getting frustrated, he just watched them. He tracked the way the moonlight filtered through their translucent wings, casting these intricate, shifting networks of pale blue shadows across the floorboards. He wrote that it was the first time he understood that the light from the stars didn't just illuminate the dark. It had a weight. It could be caught, held and softened by something as fragile as a bug's wing. The text gets a bit disorganized near the turn of the season. Eldon became completely fixated on a single point in the sky, right between the third and fourth fingers of the Weaver's hand constellation. He called it the Cobalt Meridian. It wasn't a bright star, and it wasn't a dark void. It was a tiny, localized patch of space that held a deep, permanent shade of twilight blue, even in the absolute dead of midnight, when the rest of the firmament was a stark, light-devouring black. He tried to align his iron instruments to the coordinates, but every time he locked the cross staff into position, the iron would go strangely cold to the touch, freezing the skin of his palms within seconds. He began to suspect that the blue patch wasn't a star system at all, but a place where the fabric of the sky had grown thin. In the spot where the cold from the true outside was leaking through the stitches, like a draft coming through a poorly fitted door frame. My own lamp is starting to burn down into the reservoir now, the oil turning thick and sluggish as the room cools down. The smell of the old parchment dust is heavy in the air, mixing with that crisp, clean scent of the high altitude that always makes the back of your neck feel slightly numb before you drift off to sleep. Eldon didn't leave the tower because of a crimson flare or broken lens. His final entry is just a single sentence, written with the absolute last piece of his charred willow stick. And he wrote, "The sky has been staring down at this mountain for so long that the stone is beginning to remember how to shine." Right below the text, he drew a small, rough circle to represent the open archway, but he left the center of the circle completely blank, letting the natural gray color of the sheepskin tell the rest of the story. He vanished from the records after that. The chronicles say the next observer found the attic completely empty, save for a large chunk of raw cobalt stone sitting in the center of the desk, perfectly polished along the top edge, as if someone had spent years rubbing it with a soft cloth. The background music down below is settling into its final, quiet breath now, the individual notes drifting apart, like the silver moths leaving the archway at dawn. It feels so incredibly safe here, sitting in the echo of a century that has already been completely counted and put away. You don't have to resolve Eldon's calculations tonight. You don't have to worry about the cold blue drafts leaking through the stars, or figure out what happened to the man who tracked the silence before the world grew loud. Let the charcoal lines fade back into the leather. Let the old years blur into the current dark. The watchtower is holding its position. The mountain is steady beneath the floorboards, and the night is completely quiet. Settle down into the heavy, uncomplicated stillness of the attic. Tell me, if you could step backward through the layers of your own history by 100 years, which quiet, forgotten habit of your ancestors do you think you would recognize instantly inside your own hands?